Hey guys, there are rabbits hunting men, cooking men in pots, slashing them with swords, dragging men along on leashes, shooting men from catapults, holding the weapons they use to kill them. And this is the specific detail that gets people. Tonight, we're going to figure out why. Before we get into it, take a moment to leave a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Alright, let's begin. The margin is where the hours go. In any manuscript produced in this period, the margins, the spaces around the main text, are not simply blank. They are opportunities, and what fills them tells you something important about the people who filled them, about what the medieval mind found funny and strange and worth recording. The term for margin illustration in medieval manuscripts is marginalia, and it encompasses an extraordinary range of subjects and styles. Some marginalia is straightforwardly decorative, geometric patterns, foliage, the elaborate vine scroll borders that frame pages of important text. Some is narrative, scenes from the text being illustrated, episodes from the saints' lives that the text describes. Some is didactic, moral scenes, allegorical images, visual commentary on the text that enriches the reader's understanding. And some of it is completely, bewilderingly strange. The rabbit that hunts men is part of a larger tradition of world upside-down imagery that runs through medieval art and literature. Images in which the normal order of things is reversed, in which the subordinate becomes dominant, in which the hunted becomes the hunter. Dogs are ridden by hares, donkeys play harps, women beat men. Monks drink wine while bishops do the dishes. The inversion is the point. But the rabbit that hunts men has become, of all these inversions, the most famous, and for reasons that go beyond its frequency in the manuscripts. The rabbit specifically hits something in the modern sensibility, something that Monty Python understood when they created the killer rabbit of Carbanog, which is one of the most medieval things a 20th century British comedy produced.
There he is!
Where?
There!
What, behind the rabbit?
It is the rabbit.
The question is, why rabbits? Why not dogs, or cats, or wolves, or bears, animals whose size and natural predatory capacity would make the inversion at least physically plausible? Why is it the rabbit, the small fluffy creature of English meadows and cooking pots, that shows up in the margins of sacred texts, wielding a sword? To answer this, we need to understand what a rabbit actually was in medieval England and France. And the answer is more interesting than you might expect. The rabbit, Oryctolagus cuniculus, the European rabbit, was not native to England. It was introduced, probably by the Normans in the 12th century, as a managed agricultural animal, kept in purpose-built enclosures called warrens that were owned by the nobility and the church as sources of meat and fur. This matters. In 1340, when the manuscripts that contain the most elaborate killer rabbit imagery were being produced, the rabbit was not the common, familiar, fence-nibbling creature of the English countryside that it would become after its population exploded in later centuries. It was a semi-exotic, managed animal, expensive, carefully husbanded, associated specifically with the aristocracy and the monasteries that maintained the warrens on their land. A rabbit in 1340 was a luxury item. The fur was valuable. The meat was prized, and the keeping of rabbits was a mark of status. The peasants who farmed the fields adjacent to a nobleman's warren had no right to take the rabbits, even when those rabbits ate their crops. And the rabbits did eat their crops, because rabbits do not respect property boundaries. The poaching of rabbits from a nobleman's warren was a serious offence with serious legal penalties. So the rabbit, in the world of the monk who is drawing it in the margin, is a creature that is simultaneously small and harmless looking, and the property of power, the animal that the powerful keep and the weak are forbidden from touching. The rabbit is, in this social context, an emblem of the Norman aristocracy's control over the land and the lives of the people on it. And then the rabbit picks up a sword. Here is where the world upside-down imagery becomes something more specific than generic comedy. The rabbit hunting the man in medieval manuscripts is not just a funny inversion. It is a funny inversion that carries specific social weight. that is funnier and more resonant in its specific cultural context than the image alone conveys. The hunter in medieval society was specifically the noble. Hunting was not a universal activity, it was a class privilege, protected by law, in which the aristocracy exercised dominion over the landscape and the creatures in it. The peasant who hunted, who took a deer from the forest or a rabbit from the warren without authorization, was a criminal, and the laws protecting the noble's hunting rights were among the most rigorously enforced of all medieval property laws. The image of the rabbit hunting the man is therefore, among other things, an image of the hunted hunting the hunter, the prey turning on the predator, the powerless exacting revenge on the powerful. In a society in which direct social commentary of this kind would have been dangerous, where openly mocking the nobility or the church was not a safe activity, the margin of a manuscript provided a specific kind of cover. The rabbit is not a man. The sword is not a real sword. The image is just a funny picture in the margin, and if anyone with authority objected to it, the monk who drew it could claim, truthfully in a way, that it is merely a jest, a bit of whimsy, nothing serious. The margin was a permission structure. It was a space where things could be said in images that could not be said in words, where the hierarchy could be temporarily inverted because the inversion was acknowledged as a game, as play, as something that everyone understood to be not real in a way that also conveyed, unmistakably, something felt about the real. But let's be careful not to over-politicize this because the truth is more layered. The people drawing these rabbits were not necessarily, in any conscious or organized sense, social protesters using the medium of manuscript marginalia to advance a political agenda. Many of them were monks, who were themselves members of an institution of significant power and authority in medieval society. The church owned the warrens, the church employed the scribes, the church commissioned the manuscripts. What is much more likely, and what the visual evidence of the manuscripts supports when you look at them carefully, is that the killer rabbit, like most of the bizarre marginalia, exists primarily because it was funny. Because the specific incongruity of a small, harmless, fluffy creature doing violence to a large human is a reliable source of comedy in 1340 and in 2024, because incongruity is one of the most fundamental mechanisms of humor, and the rabbit as predator is a perfect incongruity machine. The monk who drew the first killer rabbit, and we cannot know who this was, because medieval manuscript artists were rarely identified by name in their work, probably drew it because it made them laugh, and the tradition propagated because it kept making people laugh, because subsequent artists saw it in earlier manuscripts and recognized the joke and repeated it with their own variations, and the rabbit with the sword became a convention of marginalia in the way that any visual joke becomes a convention when it's good enough to be worth repeating. This is how visual culture works. It is how internet memes work. It is how folk art traditions work. An image that captures something true about human experience. In this case, the comic truth of the small defeating the large, of the powerless triumphing over the powerful in the imagination even when not in reality, propagates through imitation and variation until it becomes a genre, with its own conventions and its own internal logic and its own capacity to generate new examples. Let us look at some specific examples, because the general case is interesting, but the particular is where the actual art lives. The Smithfield decretals, produced in London in the early 14th century, are perhaps the richest single source of killer rabbit imagery in the surviving manuscript tradition. The decretals are a collection of papal laws, about as serious a legal and ecclesiastical document as the medieval world produced, and their margins are filled with scenes of such consistent absurdity that they have been the subject of serious scholarly study, trying to understand how the sacred and the profane managed to occupy the same physical space so thoroughly. In the Smithfield decretals, rabbits hunt with dogs. They are served by human attendants who carry their game bags and their hunting horns. They execute men by hanging, operating the gallows with evident competence. They conduct funerals for men, the rabbit as priest, the rabbit mourners, the rabbit gravediggers disposing of human remains with the same ceremony that human beings used to dispose of each other. The funeral scene is particularly striking because it mirrors almost exactly the imagery of the human funeral in other manuscript illustrations. The composition, the arrangement of figures, the presence of what appear to be liturgical objects, all of this is drawn in a style that references the serious iconography of death and burial, and then the figures enacting it are rabbits. The joke is deadpan in the most literal sense. It is performed with a straight face by an artist who understood the visual language of sacred imagery well enough to reproduce it perfectly, and then populated it with creatures whose presence makes the entire thing absurd. This deadpan quality is important. The killer rabbit is not funny, in spite of being drawn with the same care and skill as the serious images. It is funny because of it. The more seriously the rabbit is drawn, the funnier it is. The rabbit that clearly kills its human prey in an image rendered with as much technical care as the illuminated initial on the same page is funnier than a rabbit hastily scrawled in a margin would be. The incongruity requires both elements, the funny subject and the serious treatment, to work. There is another tradition within the manuscript rabbit imagery that is distinct from the hunting and killing sequences, and that reveals a different layer of the medieval sense of humour. Rabbits are frequently depicted in manuscripts engaged in music. They play instruments, lutes, bagpipes, horns, drums, the full range of medieval musical instrumentation represented in miniature, played by small, furry hands with apparent competence. They dance. They perform for audiences, sometimes for human audiences, sometimes for other rabbits, sometimes for mixed crowds. The musical rabbit sits at the intersection of two different medieval preoccupations. Music was a serious topic in medieval intellectual life. The theory of music, its relationship to mathematics and to the harmony of the cosmos, the role of music in liturgy, and the monkey or the rabbit playing instruments in the margin of a text dealing with these serious matters is a small joke at the expense of intellectual solemnity. Here is the profound theory of cosmic harmony, says the margin, and here is a rabbit with a bagpipe. Both are true simultaneously. There is also a specific tradition of the rabbit playing the bagpipe that appears in enough manuscripts to suggest that the association between rabbits and bagpipes was, at some point, a recognizable joke with a specific resonance that has been lost. The bagpipe itself had comic associations in the medieval period. It was considered a low-status peasant instrument, associated with the countryside and the common people rather than with courtly music, and the image of a rabbit playing it carried something of the class coding of the instrument itself. The rabbit with the bagpipe might be funnier than the rabbit with the lute for reasons that a medieval audience would have understood immediately, and that require historical reconstruction to recover. Now let us talk about what the monks who drew these images were actually doing to their manuscripts and why they were permitted to do it, because this is a question that modern readers often find puzzling. The manuscripts in which killer rabbits appear are not, for the most part, rough drafts or practice pieces. They are often high-quality finished manuscripts, sometimes extraordinarily valuable objects. Books of hours decorated with gold leaf and pigments made from lapis lazuli and malachite and vermilion, legal texts produced for wealthy patrons who paid significant sums for the work, psalters and breviaries intended for regular use in religious observance. These were not cheap objects. The materials were expensive, the labour was extensive. The patron who commissioned a book of hours decorated with killer rabbits was a person of means who had chosen to spend significant money on an object of devotion, and the book they received contained in the margins of their devotional text images of violence and comedy and the world turned upside down. And nobody seems to have objected, or rather, the objections that were raised were occasional, specific, and clearly insufficient to stop the tradition. The marginalia tradition flourished for roughly 2 centuries in its most exuberant form, and the killer rabbit appears in enough manuscripts to make clear that it was never definitively suppressed. The reason it was tolerated comes back to the theology of laughter and the role of play in medieval religious culture, which is considerably more nuanced than the popular image of medieval religious life. Grim, solemn, humorless, suggests. The medieval church had a complex relationship with laughter. On one hand, there was a strong ascetic tradition that viewed excessive laughter as a spiritual danger, a distraction from contemplation and prayer. The rule of Saint Benedict, which governed Benedictine monastic life, explicitly counselled monks against idle speech and frivolous amusement. On the other hand, there was an equally strong tradition that recognized play and laughter as part of the divine creation, that the capacity for humor was part of what distinguished human beings from animals and connected them to God. The theological concept of risus paschalis, Paschal laughter, the laughter that was appropriate to the Easter season, the joy of resurrection expressed through festivity and comic reversal, provided a framework within which certain kinds of humor were not merely permitted but spiritually appropriate. The topsy-turvy imagery of carnival, of festivity, of the world turned upside down, belonged to this tradition of sacred comedy that was not opposed to the sacred but was an expression of it, a recognition that the created world was, in its deepest nature, joyful. The killer rabbit in this reading is not a desecration of the sacred text it surrounds. It is a participation in a different register of the same sacred reality, the register that recognizes the created world's capacity for absurdity and delight, that understands the small overcoming the great as not just a social fantasy, but a theological truth. The last shall be first, the mighty shall be cast down, the meek shall inherit. The rabbit with the sword is, in this light, a kind of visual theology, however unlikely that sounds. There is a final layer to the killer rabbit tradition that is worth exploring, and it involves the specific relationship between the scribe and the text they are copying. The experience of copying a text by hand for hours, day after day, for months, produces a particular kind of relationship with the text. You know it deeply in the specific way that repetitive engagement with anything produces depth, not the analytical depth of active study, but the saturating familiarity of prolonged contact. You have held every letter in your hand. You have reproduced every phrase. You know where the text says what it says with a completeness of knowledge that the reader who reads the text once can never achieve. And you know it, in some cases, from the inside of an understanding that is also critical. A monk copying a legal text knows that the text has implications that the law does not always fulfill. A monk copying a theological treatise knows the arguments and has heard the debates and may have opinions that the text does not share. A monk copying the same psalms for the 15th time knows them so well that the words have temporarily lost their meaning in the way that any word repeated enough times loses its meaning, a phenomenon linguists call semantic satiation. The margin in these circumstances is not merely a space for decoration or comedy, it is a space for response. For the monk who knows the text deeply, the margin is the place where that deep knowing can find expression in a form that is not the text itself, but is in conversation with the text. Sometimes that conversation is serious, the scholarly gloss, the citation, the cross-reference. Sometimes it is less serious, the small figure in the margin that is a private joke with the text, or with the reader, or with the long chain of people who have made and used manuscripts like this one. The rabbit is part of this conversation. It is a response to the solemnity of the main text from the space where solemnity is not required, where the imagination can do what imagination does when it is not being closely supervised. It is the margin's answer to the text's authority. The small and the absurd responding to the large and the serious, in the way that small and absurd things have always responded to large and serious ones, by being entirely themselves, regardless of the company. The manuscripts survive. That is perhaps the strangest and most wonderful fact of this whole story, that the parchment and the ink and the careful work of those years in those scriptoria have outlasted everything else of the world they were made in. The monasteries are mostly gone, or repurposed, or converted into tourist destinations. The social world of the Norman aristocracy and the warren rabbits and the hunted peasants has been replaced by successive worlds, each one replaced in turn. The theological debates that the texts record have been continued and argued and partially resolved and partially abandoned over 7 centuries of subsequent religious history. And in the margins of the books, the rabbit is still hunting men, still drawing the sword, still dragging the human along on the leash with the specific expression, inscrutable as rabbit expressions always are, that the medieval artist gave it, and that has been travelling through time since, unchanged, waiting to be looked at. What the rabbit means has changed. In 1340, the person looking at it in the margin of their psalter understood the full social and theological context that the image inhabited, understood the warren and the hunting law and the world upside down tradition and the paschal laughter and all of it, understood it as a contemporary understands their own cultural references without effort or reconstruction. We reconstruct, we excavate, we read the scholarship and we try to reassemble what the image meant to the person who first saw it. But something survives without reconstruction. The rabbit is still funny, not in exactly the same way. We are not laughing at the same joke, with the same understanding of the social dynamics the rabbit is commenting on. But the basic mechanism, small thing with sword, triumphant over large thing, still works. The incongruity still produces the response that incongruity produces. The joke is still a joke, even translated across 7 centuries. This is what the killer rabbit tells us about medieval people. Not that they were unserious about their faith, they were extraordinarily serious about it, in ways that shaped every aspect of their existence. Not that they were revolutionary, systematically subverting the social order through manuscript marginalia. They were not, mostly. What it tells us is that they were people who found things funny, people who, given a blank space and a few inches of parchment and a pen already in their hand, drew the first thing that came to mind, which was sometimes a geometric pattern and sometimes a saint and sometimes a rabbit with a sword, because the rabbit with a sword was funny and they knew it and they wanted the next person who opened the book to know it too. 700 years later, the next person opened the book. The rabbit was still there. And it was still funny. The Monty Python Killer Rabbit first appeared in Monty Python and the Holy Grail in 1975. The creators have cited medieval manuscript marginalia as a direct inspiration. Whether they were aware of the 7th century tradition behind the specific image they chose is not recorded. The rabbit does not care either way, it has the sword. If you watched this far, take a moment to leave a like and subscribe to the channel. See you next time.